I was born in, and I'll give away the year, 1977 in Cambridge in England. I initially grew up nearby in a town called Royston, and at the age of late primary years we moved to the south coast of England to a town called Seaford, which is between Brighton and Eastbourne really, and that's really nice, really lovely place on the coast, right by the sea. And that's where I went to primary school and then later secondary school as well, and did A-levels down there on the south coast. Now, I suppose in terms of early interests, well, I did always surprisingly like history, and I also liked German and French, I should say, as languages as a child. And I decided to do all of those at GCSE. And then for me, it was kind of an easy decision as well when it came to thinking about A-levels. You have to choose 3 A-levels, and I chose German, history and English. So I suppose those kind of connections were born from an early age there. So I studied those at Seaford Head Community College, as it was called back then. I think it's probably changed its name since, but anyway, Seaford Head Community College. Great time down there. I remember it quite fondly. Good group of friends, and didn't specifically study really anything, I should say, to do with German history back then. I remember doing the French Revolution for A-level, 1848 revolutions, and so on and so forth, a kind of tour through European history. I think it was probably then that I had also had my first ever trip to Germany as a sort of exchange at A-level while studying German, and that was also great fun, and did help to sort of sow seeds of interest in all those subjects, and we travelled too. Now, probably what shaped me more actually was when I finished my A-levels. So I finished A-levels, would have that been 96? It could have been 1996 I finished my A-levels. And I had initially applied to go to university, which was kind of standard route. And then I'm not sure why, I suddenly decided at the last minute I didn't particularly feel like going straight into university. So I decided to take a year out, but a year out with no plans at all. I was working at the local supermarket, which was Safeway back then. No longer exists in the UK. And but I could not face a year working at Safeway, so I was looking for something to do. And there was an advert in the national papers. It was a time when the first kind of sort of new range of charity activities started, and new ways of charity fundraising it. And there was an advert for, would anybody like to raise funds for a charity called Scope? And the activity was, if you tried to raise money, you could spend, I think it was a week, cycling through Israel to Eilat, through the Negev desert. I thought, oh yeah, that looks, never been to Israel. I never really had any connection, to be honest. And yeah, I signed up for that. I raised a fair bit of money because I had no other plans at the time, other than working at Safeway, and went over to Israel and cycled across the desert there with a group of other people. And I think that was kind of formative in that I had this connection to another country then, a country I'd never been to. And so then I felt like I understood a little bit more about Israel and Israeli culture. After doing that, I returned back to Seaford and to Safeway, and I was looking for something else to do, and I applied to work as a kind of holiday rep and the job here was in Germany, in the Black Forest. And I spent 6 months then working on a campsite in the Black Forest, living in a tent for 6 months, welcoming the guests to the campsite and so in some small village in the Black Forest in Steinach. And again, that also then helped shape the other side of my interest in German culture at the time. So after completing that period of time in Germany, 6 months, having that experience as well in Israel, cycling across the country, that sort of laid a foundation for when I went to Germany with two broad interests that I then wanted to explore further as a student. After spending a year out and undertaking various activities, I applied to university. Applied to the University of Kiel in Staffordshire, and one of the reasons I went there was at the time for the joint honours that you could study 2 subjects at once equally. So I signed up there to study German and to study history, or I think it was purely modern history really, was what I studied there as the course. And I think fully actually, to be fair, for the first 2 years of being a student there, I probably wasn't the best of students at the University of Kiel in terms of dedication to studies and so on, if I'm honest. But the 3rd year of the course was a year in Germany, and I went to the University of Erlangen in Franconia. And I think actually that was really formative for me in terms of thinking. It was absolutely brilliant to be at a German university. I think all the courses I signed up for, I was the only foreign student really in there, the only exchange student. So that really forced me to think much more fully and to concentrate much more fully on studies, really, because maybe as an outsider you have to put more effort in, and you really have to push yourself much harder, and I found that to be the case out there. But also what was formative for me was thinking about, I was mainly studying aspects of German history with the choices I remember taking out in Erlangen. But being there, it was studying German history, but also thinking about German history from the place you're in. So I really started to connect place. Place with my thinking about the past. And this led me to want to think much more about what I was going to do for the undergraduate dissertation for when I returned to Kiel. And I thought, I want to explore the city of Erlangen. I want to think about the university, and I want to think about some of these subjects in preparation for the dissertation and for returning back to Kiel. So I decided I was going to write something then. And from reading about the history of the city, I was really got interested in the history of the university through the interwar years. And there's a big thesis done on the university from the 70s, and some local history from Ilse Sponsel, who'd done a lot of local history on the really important local history of Erlangen. But I did feel there was still more to be said, particularly about the experience of Jewish university students and Jewish academics at the university in the interwar years. And I really wanted to find out more about this. And it was going down that pathway that first wanted to know more, wanting to ask questions about how the university reacted and responded to its Jewish community in the late 20s into the 30s, that I suppose put me on the path to thinking more about German Jewish history more generally. I went down, so I booked into the university archives while I was there as an undergrad student. Which was also my first experience of archives, full stop, actually. And I had a whole series of things I wanted to look at. And the archive at that time was run by a retired history professor, a doctor professor something, I forget his surname. But when I turned up, he was probably in his late 70s, 80s, and he was like very dismissive of me and was like, why do you want to look at this? It's only, you're only writing an undergrad dissertation, you don't need to look at any of this stuff. And I was like, well, I do actually. He goes, no. And I was like, well, I want to write about the history of your German Jewish academics who were at the university at the time. And his response to me was, there were no Jews here. Why don't you go to Würzburg? There were loads of Jews at Würzburg University. I was like, no. I listed various names of Jewish academics that I'd researched in advance. I said, no, you've got to have the personnel files of these individuals and so forth. And in the end, he was like, okay, you can look at them then. And it got out this material. So on several levels, that sort of shaped me in many ways, because I was working with archival material. I was thinking about these individuals' lives. And it was that sort of social history that intrigued me and fascinated me. But then I was also interested in that response in the presence, how you could be so dismissive of this history and try and restrict this history that made me want to learn more, I suppose. So those were important. Those were really important factors in what I was doing. I returned to University of Kiel. Initially was going to be working, or Mark Roseman, who was a historian at Kiel at the time, but is now in the States. He was going to supervise dissertation, but just as I came back, he returned to he got a new position in the United States. So that meant special subject at Kiel, which was on the Holocaust, and dissertation supervision was actually taken on by Professor Colin Richmond, who was actually, he was retired, but he returned back to teach for one more year at Kiel. And Colin was is really unique character. His background was in medieval history, but he'd been quite influential later in his career in started to write about the Holocaust from a British perspective, with work on Belsen and so forth. And he was really great. He was really blunt to all of us. So to really, I think some of the students didn't know how to take Colin, but he was really supportive. He was really supportive of the work I was trying to do on academic anti-Semitism at the University of Erlangen, and really encouraged me with the dissertation. He also, which I think was important, he put me in touch with Tony Kushner at the University of Southampton. And he suggested, why don't you speak to Tony? Why don't you think about doing a master's at Southampton when you finish your undergrad degree? So I went down to Southampton, had a meeting with Tony, and eventually that led to me going down to Southampton to study a master's there. Colin very kindly put me in touch with Tony Kushner at Southampton, and at that time Southampton had, and still does I believe, had a really good master's programme in Jewish, non-Jewish relations. And I spoke to Tony about this, and I stressed that I really wanted to do continue thinking about German history. And he was like, oh yeah, no, come Southampton, think about German history and think about Jewish, non-Jewish relations combined, really. So yeah, so I took another year out. I'd like a year out. So I took another year out before I went down to Southampton to do the Masters. And during this second year out, I spent a bit of time working in Germany, in Lindau, or near Lindau, was where I worked for 6 weeks, 8 weeks or so down there, for obscure reasons, for a air conditioning company. But anyway, I won't go too much into that. And then I decided I'd also work for a while to save money to afford a master's, to be able to study a master's. So I worked for Kimberly-Clark, the toilet roll manufacturer in Brighton, near Brighton Station. And that was to raise enough money to study a master's. In the end though, I was actually quite fortunate and had funding for the Masters to study Jewish non-Jewish relations in Southampton. So that all worked out quite nicely. I was very lucky. So Jewish non-Jewish relations Masters at Southampton was part of the Parkes Institute at Southampton, at the University of Southampton. Parkes Institute, which stems from the pioneering work of James Parkes. It was a really brilliant community, and still is a really good community at Southampton, of people thinking about the broad issues of Jewish non-Jewish relations, but from a whole range of different angles. And I really liked being part of that community there. Regular seminars, but people willing to discuss and make you think about loads of different things you'd not come across before. Very different experience being part of that than I'd had at Keele before as an undergrad. So I really liked that leap up, but also working with a group of scholars thinking about similar issues. There's also a really fantastic library, the Parkes Library at Southampton. And I think I'd never been overwhelmed by so many books on subjects I was interested in before at all. So that was great. So I was studying there for the Masters. I decided to write my MA dissertation on Jewish displaced persons camps in post-1945 Germany. And because of my experiences doing the undergrad dissertation, I thought I want to go out to Germany and I want to go and use some of the German archives. I want to have a wander around some of the towns where these DP camps once were. So I remember going out there and wandering around Landsberg, Wolfratshausen, all around Munich, because I increasingly, and that's something that's always stuck with me since, is I think the importance of seeing places, walking around places, connecting past and present, and thinking about the location you're in, it really helps one to think about the history you're trying to write as well. So I completed the Masters at Southampton, and because I liked it down there so much at the time, I applied to continue at Southampton to write a PhD, to study for a PhD. And the subject I came to for the PhD, which had kind of intrigued me, was German Jewish soldiers in the First World War. But less about the lived experience of German Jewish soldiers in the First World War, but what had happened to the soldiers after the First World War. How had these soldiers been remembered? Because I suppose what increasingly found was you kind of pose questions to yourself. You're thinking, hang on, German Jewish soldiers were in the First World War. The Nazi regime, or the Nazi party to start with, is coming out of the First World War. The First World War is central to the Nazi party, yet we've got German Jews that fought in the conflict. So how did those two fit together? And these are questions I was asking myself. I wanted to explore further. So that was the subject of my doctoral PhD research. And for that, again, spent quite a bit of time in wandering around Germany, going to different archives in Germany. I spent, I think, 3 months living in Hamburg, a few months then over in Berlin, a few months down in Freiburg at the different archives, the various archives in these places, and then wandering around different cities and local archives in between researching it and writing this PhD. So I completed the PhD, and then faced the massive problem that's only got worse and worse and more difficult, which is the academic jobs market. I was doing some teaching at Southampton with undergrad students, and I managed to get a bit of teaching as well at Portsmouth, just down the road at the University of Portsmouth, teaching a whole range of subjects. And then I was quite lucky to get I think it was maybe 6-month, 9-month contract at Portsmouth to replace a colleague there who'd got a sabbatical. So I worked full-time then at University of Portsmouth. And then that role came to an end, and I thought, gosh, I'm not getting any younger here. I'm not sure how many years I can spend looking for academic jobs. So I was looking at different things outside of academia, really. I had a few different interviews, both for academic jobs and non-academic jobs. And one of the, just as I think I was getting to the end of my patience with the academic job market, really, had an interview at the University of Chester, and I'd never been to Chester before in my life. And it's a really lovely city. Love the city. It was quite a small university back then. Seemed really friendly, like the university, like the city, and they offered me the job. And I have been there ever since. I've been at Chester ever since. And why have I been at Chester ever since? Well, one becomes quite, you get used to where you're working. But also at Chester, my wife, we had an agreement that whoever got a job first would move to where the other one got the job, and she really was really nice, and is always really nice, Victoria, and she moved up with me to Chester, and she was working in Salford and now in Liverpool, and that's where we kind of settled there with family, children, and that's where I still am today. I think every academic really can only do work with the help of others. You can't move forward. You can't think about the past. You can't research the past unless you're working with other people. So I've always been incredibly grateful for everyone who's helped me along the way, really. And there's so many people who have done that. And I mentioned already Tony Kushner and Colin Richmond and Mark Roseman, and really in early stages they did so much to help me move forwards and help me to think differently about the past as well. So I'm always remain incredibly grateful to all three of them. When it comes to, I suppose, as a PhD student, you're always thankful for your supervisors, because your supervisors do shape so much of what you're writing, and you look up to them as well for the kind of support, because they've been there, they've done that, and they've written about the kind of topics you're trying to think about too. Now my PhD supervisors, I was lucky to have two supervisors who were jointly supervising at the time. When Neil Gregor at Southampton and Niels Römer, who was at Southampton but now is in the States as well. And they worked as a bit of a double act when I was doing my PhD, but they were both brilliant in very different ways. Neil is fantastic in terms of just telling me quite bluntly how things were when I was as a student, and telling me what I'd done wrong, but also what he liked, and I really respected that. Niels had a really good understanding of where a lot of the German Jewish source material might be, and he was really helpful in that regard. So both of those shaped me as a PhD student, and Neil Gregor we're still very much in close contact, and Neil has always been a really great supporter. I'm really grateful for that in everything I've done since. And what I've always really respected about Neil is that the questions that he can ask quite pointed questions that you think you know where you are with a topic, and then he'll ask something and you think, no, I don't know where I am with this. I do need to think about this more. And I suppose that's what I've always found so crucial, is that ability to ask difficult questions, to force me sometimes out of my comfort zone as well, to reflect on something in a very different way. So Neil has always been brilliant on that journey with me. When I started at University of Chester, the head of department back then was Keith Maclay, who was a historian really of Scottish history, military history, Scottish military history. But Keith was head of department, and he was influential, not particularly in terms of German history or German Jewish history, but he was influential in terms of providing that kind of collegial atmosphere and really nice working atmosphere, and being supportive of people as early career researchers, and understanding that you may have a lecturing job and you may have vast responsibilities to students, but research is also important, and he was very keen for all of us to move up in our careers at Chester, and he provided the time as far as he could to allow opportunities for us for sabbaticals and to allow opportunities to see research grow, and he was really encouraging of that. So I'm really thankful in very different ways for his support back then as well. Whenever you read anything, it leaves some kind of influence on you, and that's always been the case with me too. And that's why I always enjoyed the Parkes Library at Southampton so much, because it was not a German library where everything's has to be ordered up and seen. Open access library on Jewish history, and you could just wander around and find anything. So I love that, because you sort of dip into different things. And not know where you're going and find something new. But I think in terms of, I can go way back for a book that has been influential for me, and that's George Mosse, the renowned seminal work really in terms of German Jewish history. But it's not his work on fascism or German Jewish history more generally that I want to mention. Is his book Fallen Soldiers, about the memory of war and the legacies of the First World War. Now, I guess I must have read that as an MA student, a master's student. That must have been the first time I encountered it. But I just remember reading it. It had a real effect on me. It's a brilliant way of writing, for one, but it was the subject matter. It was the fact that he was taking the First World War, and perhaps I wasn't that well read at the time, but he was taking the First World War and he was kind of approaching it through a very different lens. It was through the lens of cultural history predominantly. And I just loved the way he was thinking about sort of mundane objects of the conflict and writing about the trivialization of war and the trivialization of the brutality of war, and how it sort of rendered meaningless in some of the objects that came out of it. That stuck with me. But I suppose also stuck with me were the way he kind of approached thinking about the legacies of conflict and the memory of conflict. And those questions of memory were really important, have been really important, I suppose, in what I've done since. So George Mosse's book was really shaped the way I was thinking at that time. Early in his book, he talks about German Jews fighting in the war, fighting the First World War. 12,000 German Jews, almost 12,000 German Jews, lose their lives in the conflict. So they have a really substantial role in the conflict. And that's mentioned by Mosse early on. And he says, though, that anti-Semitism rises during the First World War, which it does. And anti-Semitism at the end of the First World War stops German Jews being able to remember their war dead. And he's also right in that. Because there is a big rise in anti-Semitism during the conflict and after the conflict. So German Jews fight in the war, but they can't remember their dead, is the point he's trying to make. And I read that, and I was really struck by that. But then, towards the end of his book, later on in the book, he talks about the Nazis, the Nazi regime, and the way that they try to take control of the memory of the First World War. They utilise the memory of the First World War in their rise to power, and they try and shape the the memory of conflict as well for their own purposes. And at this point, he also talks about the fact that the Nazi regime attacked Jewish war memorials and had the names of German Jews taken off of town war memorials across Germany. Again, which did happen in certain cases. But I remember reading that and thinking, hang on, early on in your book you tell us that German Jews could not remember the war, that they were excluded from war memory. Later on in your book you tell us that war memorials with Jewish names on were attacked. And I thought, well, the two can't entirely stack up. Both are right, but there's got to be somewhere in between. Because in order to remove Jewish names from war memorials across Germany, they had to be on war memorials to start with. So I was reading that book. I loved the book. I loved what he was saying about war memory and how influential that was, or how important that was in interwar Europe. But he just raised two questions then that I wanted to know more about. And it was about how the German Jewish soldiers of the First World War were remembered and how that memory was attacked. And I wanted to fill in the gaps in between what George Mosse was saying in his book, Fallen Soldiers. So for me, that was the most influential book to start with when I started my career. And I still return to it now because it's fantastic. And I tell my students to read it as well. Earlier on in my career, there were lots of issues really pertinent to German history that I wanted to explore and aspects of German Jewish history as well. For example, for a while I started off thinking about a research project that I really wanted to see grow in terms of environmental history, particularly post-45 environmental history in Germany, and thinking of the place of East Germany within this as well. And I did start doing some research on that. But what struck me was that actually the only way to pursue a lot of this research is to spend a good 12 months or so in Germany. And I think one of the restrictions, and it's a really nice restriction to have, is that one gets to an age, have a family, and I'm not going to leave my family for young children at school and so forth. That I think I can't really just disappear for 12 months or whatever. So I've increasingly decided to shape the research that I do based around what fits with family life, what fits with a job teaching students at the University of Chester, and what's manageable in those regards. So the last big project I've done took me away really from German Jewish history. So I wrote my first two books on aspects of German Jewish experience and memory of the First World War. I also really was fortunate to work with other colleagues on producing a couple of edited volumes as well around issues to do with German Jewish history. And that followed with another volume on with a wonderful colleague, Roland Clark at Liverpool University, on European fascism. But more recently, I've just finished writing a book on the enemy war dead, and what led me to think about that, and it's removed from German Jewish history really, what led me to think about that was the locality of this history, that this is a history that plays out around where I was living, around Cheshire, but it's also a history that plays out in Germany. So it allowed me to research and made research possible with other commitments, so as well as being a fascinating topic for me. But in terms of where I'd like to go, these kind of thoughts have always now been at the back of my mind. What can I do with work, where I work, and my responsibilities for students at Chester? What can I do with my own family life as well? And also I think in terms of environmental issues as well, I'm very conscious. I don't want to spend my time flying halfway around the world to research things. I will always try and take the train to Germany to do research, but that takes more time. So what can fit with all of this? So the one topic I'm really intrigued by at the moment is the history of the Mond family. Ludwig Mond, Alfred Mond, a big German Jewish family based for a lot of their time in Cheshire, but links back to Germany, where the family originally came from, links to Italy, links to Palestine in the 1920s. So a really transnational family. So I've started to think again about German Jewish history through the lens of this family's history. And that's a subject, that's a topic that I want to pursue in much more depth. But it also is very convenient to me because it's if you like, a local history to me too. So that's where I'd like to go. Yeah, so German Jewish history on the first glance would seem quite far removed from British society today. But I suppose the answer obviously is it's not. Now, I suppose you could think about this, and maybe that's a very valid way to think about it as well, about German Jewish history, is purely in terms of lessons from the past. And how we can think about the past to try and shape the present, and to think much more about the challenging, very challenging world we live in today. And that's incredibly valid. But for me, I suppose, I suppose I've been influenced, I've been really influenced by a lot of the way the writing of German Jewish history is developed, say, within Germany. And if we're far removed from that kind of stage of affairs where German Jewish history was, if you like, a kind of a subculture, a subdiscipline, that Jewish history was a minor part of German studies or German history taught in German universities. The German Jewish history now is far more fundamental to German history. That German Jewish history is a part of German history. So I think, I suppose the work of Peter Gay, the work of Til van Raden, when thinking about Jews and other Germans, that's the way, that's what I've seen as important in how we consider German Jewish history. But I think that can also very much apply to here in Britain, that we shouldn't just see German Jewish history as a kind of outsider history. I think we need to see German Jewish history as a part of the shaping of modern Britain, as a part of British history, really. And not just in London, because that's obvious, but beyond London too. If I just look again at Cheshire, I mentioned the Mond family, one of the most influential industrial families in the northwest of England. It's part of this was a German Jewish family who shape that part of the British experience, that part of British history. And I think if you go around, you can localise German Jewish history within Britain and make it a part of this wider story. Some of the work I've done, for example, on prisoner of war camps. There are a lot of First World War prisoner of war camps within the northwest of England. There was a couple in Cheshire. Well, German Jews, Austrian Jews end up locked up in these camps. Manchester Jewish community during the First World War has a big connection to some of the camps, supplying some of the prisoners, some of the internees with their religious needs, local rabbis from Manchester going down to the camps as well. So you've got these interconnections there of German Jewish history as a part of British history, and I think that's important. I had a brilliant MA student a few years back who wrote again about, he did a wonderful dissertation on Jewish refugees in the 1930s in Greer Castle in North Wales. And again, that's kind of what I really liked about that, was localising German Jewish history in Wales, in northwest England. And I think that's what's important. If we don't see the history of German Jews as somehow removed from Britain, as somehow an outsider story, I think we need to see it as a part of British history. And I think if we could do that, we'll be able to tell ourselves a much more integrated and all-encompassing history of the past that will speak to many more people about why German Jewish history is important to British society today. History has never been more important. We're living in such tumultuous times, really dangerous times, sadly, is where we find ourselves across the globe. And this makes an understanding of the past more and more crucial. But we're also at a time, I think, where there is a massive interest in history. We're also living in this time of culture wars, and history is at the centre of this. So people are interested in the past. Yet we're also at a time where academic history is under threat. Is under threat in the UK because of a lack of funding, because of a lack of, sadly, a lack of value being put on the study of history perhaps, or the study of humanities more generally. And this is not just in the UK, it's in the United States, it's in the Netherlands, it's in Germany. History is under attack as an academic discipline across the board. And history has to survive in universities, and it has to flourish, and it really has to flourish in universities. It's central to them. And if German Jewish history as a subject is also to flourish, it needs to do so, and it needs to be continued to be taught, it needs to be continued to be researched, it needs to continue to be supported at universities. So we need stronger universities, and we need stronger encouragement of history research across the board. That's in general. German Jewish history as a discipline, though, has to continue, and it has done, it has to continue to be an open discipline. I've come, as I've explained, I've somehow found my way into research in German Jewish history from somebody who grew up on the south coast of England with no connection to Germany, and not from a Jewish family background either. I think I was the first person in my family really to ever go to Germany at all. So the openness of the discipline is important. It has to embrace people from all backgrounds, because if we want to understand different histories, we need people from different backgrounds to enter, to explore and want to explore these histories. And I think that is crucial. I'm very much an outsider across the board in German Jewish history. I'm aware of that. But I've always found people open, willing, and actually generally pleased that I've been interested in researching this history. And I think that's important that continues for future generations and the next generation of researchers who come after me.